We finished the last video introducing the idea of ecological succession. So this is the sequence of community and ecosystem changes that happen after a disturbance. And there are two main types of succession. Primary succession, which occurs when you have a total and complete disturbance where no soil exists afterwards, and you have to replenish that soil. Secondary succession is when you've had a more mild disturbance and soil remains after the disturbance. After a disturbance, some species tend to be able to arrive early, and those are species that tend to have wider dispersal, so they may have seeds that float on the wind, for instance. They're able to disperse more quickly to other places, and they tend to be, especially in primary succession, species that don't need as much soil. So you can't have an oak tree, even if an oak tree seed, right, an acorn happens to land in an area after you've had a volcano eruption, it's not going to grow, right? So you have a very specific set of early arrivals that can get there first through dispersal and can grow. And these may facilitate the appearance of later species. They may make the environment more favorable. This is often what you see. Or they could fight off and inhibit the establishment of later species, or they could have no effect at all. A great example of primary succession is following retreating glaciers. So as glaciers melt and pull back, you can observe this process. And so Glacier Bay, Alaska is an example of this. You have this exposed moraine that's bare, and it gets colonized by pioneering plants first, like liverworts, mosses, and fireweed, things that can grow on essentially no soil, and they begin to establish soil. And then dryas and willows and cottonwoods follow. So here's a look at Glacier Bay, where we're looking at, and you can see this glacier up here is receding, and this first stage is called the pioneer stage. And fireweed, this kind of pretty pink flower, is the dominant plant because it doesn't need much soil. It can help break up that initial rock, and as it dies and breaks down, it can itself form part of the soil. Grasses are often part of this pioneer stage. Once you have some established soil, you get to this dryas stage, which are these sort of low matted shrubs that have these pretty white flowers. And at this point, the soil is pretty bare of nutrients like nitrogen. And dryas can survive there because they are nitrogen fixers, or they have mutualistic relationships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so a few decades after this pioneer stage, the dryas take over and become the dominant species. And after a few decades, the soil begins to change, and you can move on to the next stage. Once you have thicker, more nutrient-filled soil, alders begin to grow. So these are actual trees, but they're thin trees, they're fast-growing, and they form these dense thickets. And they, in turn, will begin to shade out some of these other things and adjust the soil. And the alders are eventually overgrown by Sitka spruce, western hemlock, mountain hemlock, these bigger, more slow-growing trees that then can shade out smaller trees like the alders. And so you end up with this mature-looking forest many, many decades later. This succession occurs over a long period of time, where we're shading out underbrush, and you don't have as many shrubs like this or as many thin trees. You've got these big, thick, mature shading trees. And it's the vegetation at each stage of succession that ends up causing the environment to be able to then be a habitat for the subsequent succession stage in that vegetation. And then what vegetation is available dictates what animals are available. So animals are part of the succession too, but plants are the main drivers of it, right? They change the pH of the soil, the nitrogen content, the amount of soil, things like that. This is a look at the amount of soil nitrogen during each of these stages, right? Pioneer increases it just a little bit. Once the dryas stage comes, the dryas stage increases it a lot, and then the alder stage increases it even more. And by the time we get to the spruce stage, we have a thriving ecosystem with lots of nitrogen in the soil that's replenished by the dropping of needles and leaves from larger trees. While there are a lot of natural disturbances that occur all the time, some of the most impactful disturbances in the past decades and centuries have been human disturbances, and our disturbances tend to reduce species diversity. One example of this is coral bleaching, right? Because of the rising temperatures of the ocean and also the acidification of the ocean due to CO2, coral eject their symbionts, and that leads them to die and turn white, and ultimately those coral reefs then die off, and they're not providing that habitat for all these other organisms. And we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. Two of the major factors that impact how diverse a species community is latitude, right? How far north or south are you? How far away from the equator, essentially? And also, how big is the area? Generally, the closer to the equator you are, the more species richness you're going to have, the more biodiverse your community is going to be. And why is a little bit of a mystery, but it probably has something to do with climate and evolutionary history. In temperate communities like ours and polar communities, you've had glaciation events occur repeatedly over the millennia, and so you repeatedly have to start over essentially with your evolution of communities. And in the tropical environments, you haven't had that happen. So you have often a longer evolutionary history without interruptions. Also, the growing season is longer, so biological time runs faster. You may have more generations occur in a year, and so evolution can run more quickly. Also, there's just more solar energy near the equator and more water availability, right? Not as you get further away to the deserts at 30 degrees, but as you are around the equator, you have a lot of water, a lot of solar energy, and this means you have a lot of productivity, which can lead to a lot of biodiversity. And you can measure this amount of water and energy by evapotranspiration, which you can measure from kind of the satellite level. And as you get more evapotranspiration, your species richness tends to be higher amongst plants and trees specifically in this example. And that also impacts vertebrates. So vertebrates tend to have higher species diversity, although the graph looks a little different when there's higher potential evapotranspiration. Additionally, all else being equal, bigger habitats tend to be more biodiverse. So let me show you an example, a species area curve of some North American breeding birds. In habitats with larger areas, so more uninterrupted habitat, you tend to get a higher number of species, right? Better species richness. This means islands are interesting to look at. And generally on islands, the species richness depends on the size of the island, but also its distance from the mainland and how much immigration and extinction that you see. The island equilibrium model describes a situation where the more species you have on an island, generally the less immigration there's going to be, because new species that happen to land on your island, if you have more species, they're not likely to be new species, right? So if a bird happens to land on your island and there are already a lot of species, it's probably not a new species of bird, right? But if you have very few species, it's probably going to be a new species and it'll increase your total biodiversity, right? So also, the more species you have on an island, the more there are to go extinct. So your extinction rate goes up. And so immigration goes down, extinction rate goes up. And so there's this line, this equilibrium number where you hit your sort of peak biodiversity, right, at a certain number of species. But what that equilibrium number is depends on the size of the island and how far it is from the mainland. Bigger islands tend to have equilibrium numbers that are, bigger, right, that include more species, because bigger islands tend to have more different niches, for instance. They're also easier for a random bird to land on. And that larger number of niches means you can have a larger number of species. The closer you are to the mainland, the more species are going to happen upon your island, and so you're going to tend to have an equilibrium number that includes more species, more biodiversity. So the bigger your island, the closer you are to the mainland, the more biodiversity you're going to tend to have. And so you might look at the Galapagos, and all of those islands are about the same amount of distance from the mainland, but they're all different sizes, and so you may predict the species richness to increase with island size. Lo and behold, that's exactly what you see. In general, the larger the island in the Galapagos, the more plant species there are. As is probably obvious now, pathogens can also have huge impacts on a species community. Very often these are viruses or viroids or prions. Sometimes they're other microorganisms like bacteria or fungus. And if they're new to a community, they can alter the structure quickly and extensively. Humans often have some hand in the new spread of many of these pathogens, and understanding community ecology is important to help combat them. And in some ways, your body is a community, and so understanding, for instance, beneficial bacteria is helpful for understanding how to fight off bad bacteria. So understanding community ecology is important for medicine as well. Here's an example of a disease that humans have brought into a lot of caves called white-nosed bat syndrome. And it's this fungus that gets on bat noses, and during their winter torpor, it keeps bothering them, and so they wake up and do this kind of thing, and they don't get to sleep, and their metabolism doesn't drop like it should, and they end up dying. And biologists will find caves in the spring or late in the winter that have just piles of dead bats on the bottom. Diseases or pathogens that are transferred from animals to humans we call zoonotic pathogens, and sometimes this can be via a vector, like malaria, for instance. And sometimes they transport from an animal into a human, and they evolve to then affect and stay in human hosts and pass from one human to another. A lot of our emerging diseases today are zoonotic, and these are becoming more of a factor now as we spread into more and more parts of the world, and we spread into more and more habitats in those different parts of the world. We're coming across more and more of these potentially zoonotic pathogens. Malaria and West Nile are examples of vector-borne, mosquito-borne zoonotic pathogens. Avian flu, initially, as the name would suggest, came from birds. And ecologists are studying the potential spread of that virus from Asia to North America because of migrating birds. Coronavirus was found, as you probably have heard, in bats initially, and was able to jump from bats to humans, and now is able to be spread human to human. Right? It took a step of evolution from that virus to be able to exploit a new host, but that jump was made. HIV also came from chimpanzees and made the jump to humans, probably because of the consumption of bushmeat. Chimpanzees themselves weren't the original hosts for HIV. It was monkeys, and chimpanzees probably got it when they were eating monkeys. And again, that HIV virus had a little bit of an evolutionary jump, and it gained the ability to take hold in chimpanzees. And as one last reminder, we can describe these interspecific interactions often based on whether they benefit or harm each party in the interaction, right? And this is a list that's found in your book that describes how each party is affected in each of these types of interspecific interaction.